Flaxborough Bowling Club prided itself on being the quietest institution in town, which was why the noise carried so oddly that Thursday morning. It was not loud in any conventional sense, no shouts, no alarms, but a sustained murmur of voices that did not belong to bowls players discussing the weather or the state of the green. It came from the clubhouse, and it had the unmistakable quality of mild outrage. Mrs. Violet Hearn, who kept the club's accounts and believed firmly that theft was something that happened elsewhere, stood just inside the doorway, holding the ledger to her chest as if it might also disappear. She had discovered the burglary while preparing for the afternoon roll-up and had responded as she did to most disruptions by ringing 3 people in quick succession and then making tea. The missing items were at first glance unimpressive. A silver presentation cup, engraved, slightly dented, awarded for the 1968 Inter-Counties Friendly, had vanished from the display cabinet. So had a smaller brass bowl, a set of old medals, and most inexplicably, the battered cash tin kept in the bottom drawer of the secretary's desk. The tin was usually empty except for shillings and notes from the raffle fund, but it was the principle of the thing that troubled Mrs. Hearn. By 10 o'clock, half the town seemed to know. At the newsagent's, Mr. Pemberton announced that it was the thin end of the wedge, though he could not say what wedge this might be. Outside the butcher's, 2 men speculated that the clubhouse door had never properly locked since the war. At the bus stop, a woman whispered that she had always mistrusted anyone who bowled left-handed. The bowling club itself absorbed the gossip with a peculiar mixture of embarrassment and pride. A burglary suggested scandal, but it also suggested importance. One did not burgle places of no consequence. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly after 11, having walked from the station at an unhurried pace. That suggested nothing in particular. He wore his usual suit, a shade darker than the day required, and carried his notebook as though it were a personal affectation rather than a professional necessity. He paused before entering the clubhouse, reading the notice board with mild interest: raffle results, a postponed fixture, an appeal for volunteers to repaint the benches. Inside, the air smelled of polish, tea, and affronted respectability. Mrs. Hearn greeted him with a tight smile. "It's a terrible business, Inspector." "Yes," said Purbright gently. "I understand something has gone astray." "Several things," she corrected, "though I don't suppose they'll be melted down or anything dreadful like that." Purbright nodded as if this possibility had never occurred to him. He glanced at the cabinet, its glass door ajar, the empty velvet-lined spaces creating a faintly toothless effect. "And when did you last see everything in its proper place?" he asked. "Yesterday evening. I locked up myself. I always do. I'm very particular." "I'm sure," Purbright said. Around them hovered a small group of members, men whose expressions suggested that the club had been violated in a deeply personal way. Among them was Councillor Alfred Greaves, who had chaired the Amenities Committee for as long as anyone could remember and regarded the bowling green as a moral achievement. "It's disgraceful," Greaves said. "This sort of thing didn't happen before outsiders started drifting through." Purbright smiled politely. "Outsiders?" "Well," Greaves said, "you know." Purbright made a note, though not of outsiders specifically. He had learned that such words often pointed inwards. He examined the door. No damage. The window latch was secure. The desk drawer showed signs of having been opened with a familiarity that suggested practice rather than force. "Nothing else disturbed?" Purbright asked. "No," said Mrs. Hearn, though the kettle had been moved. "I always leave it to the left." Purbright paused, his pencil hovering. "Moved how? Just elsewhere, on the other side of the sink. Did you mention that to anyone?" Mrs. Hearn hesitated. It seemed silly. Purbright nodded again, this time more thoughtfully. By lunchtime, the theory had already settled. It was almost certainly young Derek Spence, recently dismissed from his post at the garages and known to loiter near the recreation ground. Someone had seen him passing the club on Wednesday evening. Someone else recalled that he once borrowed a bowl and never returned it. Purbright listened to these conclusions with patient attention, asking nothing, correcting no one. He took notes, he thanked people for their time. As he left the clubhouse, he glanced back at the empty cabinet once more. It struck him, not for the first time, that crimes of this nature were rarely about the objects themselves. Cups and tins were merely convenient vessels. Outside, the town continued on, reassured that something had happened and that someone else was now responsible for it. Inspector Purbright walked back towards the station, already aware that the real disturbance lay not in what had been taken, but in what had been quietly revealed. By mid-afternoon, Flaxborough had reached the agreeable stage of indignation, where certainty flourished without evidence. Inspector Purbright was aware of this condition. He had encountered it before, usually just after lunch, and often in places where tea was taken seriously. It was why he avoided drawing conclusions while others were still enjoying theirs. He did not return immediately to the station. Instead, he crossed the recreation ground at a pace suggesting mild interest in the ducks, and stopped briefly to observe the bowling green from the far side. Play had resumed, though with a certain stiffness, as if the game itself were under scrutiny. Bowls rolled with exaggerated care. Conversation, when it occurred, was lowered, weighted. Purbright noted who looked towards the clubhouse and who did not. He turned, then toward Market Street, where gossip had settled into its afternoon rounds. At Pemberton's newsagent, the bell announced his arrival with unnecessary enthusiasm. "Inspector," said Mr. Pemberton, leaning forward as though the counter were a confidant, "you'll want to speak to young Spence." "So I've been told," Purbright replied. "Shifty sort, never looks you in the eye." Purbright considered this. "I've found," he said mildly, "that people who do look one in the eye are not always doing so for the same reason." Mr. Pemberton absorbed this without enthusiasm. "Still," he said, "you can't deny it looks bad." Purbright smiled. Many things do. He made a few purchases, items that gave no indication of haste, and continued along the street. Outside the butcher's, Mrs. Tallis paused mid-sentence upon seeing him, then resumed with renewed delicacy. Further on, Councillor Greaves emerged from the chemist, nodding briskly, already rehearsing a version of events in which order was restored, and no embarrassment lingered. Purbright acknowledged him and walked on. At the far end of the street he found Derek Spence sitting on the low wall near the bicycle racks, kicking at loose gravel with studied disinterest. Derek was young in the way that suggested both possibility and grievance. He looked up when Purbright approached, then away again. "Good afternoon," Purbright said. Derek shrugged. "I suppose. I hear you were near the bowling club on Wednesday." "Everyone's near it. It's in the middle." "That's true," Purbright agreed. "Were you inside?" Derek's jaw tightened. "No. Ever been?" "Once. Didn't like it." "Why not?" Derek hesitated, as if unused to being asked. They stare. Purbright nodded. "People do." He asked a few more questions. Where Derek had gone that evening, whom he'd seen, what he'd done after supper. Derek answered plainly, with the faint resentment of someone accustomed to not being believed. There were gaps, but no more than one might expect from a Wednesday night without particular distinction. Purbright thanked him and left. He did not make a note immediately. Later, back at the station, Sergeant Lovegrove laid out the preliminary report with tidy confidence. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, items small, transportable, likely local offender. Councillor Greaves had already suggested tightening security. "Any money missing?" Lovegrove asked. "Some," Purbright said, "though not enough to justify the trouble." Lovegrove frowned. "Souvenirs?" "Possibly," Purbright said, "or messages." He spent the next hour reviewing the list of members, not for names, but for patterns, long memberships, short tempers, recent disappointments. He noticed that several individuals had reason to feel overlooked, particularly where awards and recognition were concerned. Cups did not go missing at random. They were symbols with memories attached. In the early evening, Purbright returned once more to the bowling club, this time unannounced. The clubhouse was quiet, save for Mr. Lionel Brixby, the vice-captain, who was polishing bowls with unnecessary vigour. "Can't be too careful now," Brixby said. "No," Purbright agreed. He wandered the room as though recalling something he had misplaced. His eyes rested again on the sink. The kettle now returned to its customary position. "Who made tea last night?" he asked. Brixby looked surprised. "I did." "After the meeting? Alone?" "Well, Mrs. Hearn had gone, but Councillor Greaves was still about, sorting papers." "And the kettle?" Brixby blinked. "I suppose I moved it." "Why?" "I don't know. Habit." Purbright smiled. Habits were rarely without explanation. People simply forgot when they had begun. As he left, he paused by the cabinet once more. Empty spaces had a way of speaking, especially in places where objects stood for more than themselves. Outside, dusk settled into Flaxborough with its usual efficiency. Lights came on, doors closed, conversations drifted indoors. Inspector Purbright walked slowly back toward his office, content for the moment to let the town speak a little more freely. It always did, given time. And time, he knew, was rarely stolen without purpose. The following morning arrived with the kind of clarity that encouraged certainty. Flaxborough woke convinced that the matter was already half solved, and Inspector Purbright found this confidence drifting ahead of him like mist as he walked once more toward the bowling club. He did not hurry. Haste, in his experience, suggested a destination one was anxious to reach. Inside the clubhouse, Mrs. Hearn was arranging cups of tea with renewed precision, the cabinet behind her still conspicuously vacant. She greeted Purbright with relief, edged faintly by suspicion, as though wondering why he had not yet restored the world to its previous order. "I was thinking all night," she said, lowering her voice, "about who might know where things are kept." "That's very conscientious of you," Purbright replied. "Who came to mind?" "Well," she said carefully, "members come and go, but only a few stay late. The committee, mostly." Purbright accepted his tea and listened. She spoke of Mr. Lionel Brixby again, of Councillor Greaves, of Mr. Harold Minton, whose application for honorary membership had been declined 2 years running. Each name carried a tone rather than an accusation, and Purbright recorded these inflections with interest. Motives often hid in the manner of their mention. He excused himself and stepped outside, where the green lay immaculate and faintly resentful of attention. A pair of bowlers were practicing with studious silence. One glanced up, then quickly away, as though Purbright's presence implied a test. Purbright wandered to the benches, where he encountered Miss Ethel Rockham, the club's longest-standing female associate member and unofficial custodian of memory. She was knitting, a fact which reassured him. "Good morning," he said. "Oh," she replied, brightening. "Have you found them yet?" "Not yet." She nodded. "I didn't think you would. Not quickly." "Why's that?" "Well," she said, tightening a stitch, "people don't take things like that unless they mean something by it." Purbright sat beside her. "Meaning is a flexible thing." "Yes," Miss Rockham agreed, "but resentment is not." She spoke then of the presentation cup, the way it had been awarded, the speech Councillor Greaves had made, the way Mr. Minton had stood at the back with his hands in his pockets. He was next in line, she said. Everyone knew it. "Did he say anything?" Purbright asked. "Not at the time. But silence is often a statement." Purbright thanked her and stood, noticing as he did so that one of the benches had been freshly scrubbed, its surface still damp. "Cleaning day?" he asked. "Oh, no," Miss Rocombe said. "That was yesterday evening. Someone spilt tea." "Who?" She paused. "I don't know, but it was careless." Carelessness, Purbright thought, was rarely accidental, when it involved tea. Later he called at the town hall, where Councillor Greaves received him with practised cordiality. The councillor's office was neat to the point of austerity, save for a framed photograph of the bowling club committee, the silver cup gleaming in the centre. "Unfortunate business," Greaves said. "We rely on trust." "Do you?" Purbright asked mildly. Greaves smiled thinly. Within reason. They discussed security, funding, reputations. Greaves spoke of maintaining standards, of not allowing minor incidents to undermine confidence. He did not mention the cup. "Who locked up on Wednesday?" Purbright asked. "I believe Mrs. Hearn did, though I was still there, finalizing minutes." "Did you leave together?" "No, I stayed on." "For how long?" Greaves hesitated, then waved a hand. "I couldn't say exactly." Purbright noted the hesitation, the hand. People often gestured when time was uncertain. By midday, he had spoken to half a dozen more individuals, each conversation, offering a fragment of something unfinished. The kettle moved, the tea spilt, the cup admired and resented. Small things, but small things accumulated. At the station, Sergeant Lovegrove was growing impatient. "We can't go on like this," he said. "Either it's Spence or it isn't." "Indeed," Purbright said, "and at present it isn't." Lovegrove sighed. "Then who?" Purbright looked at the list again, then folded it away. "Someone who was comfortable," he said. "Someone who knew where everything was, and who would not be questioned immediately." "That narrows it considerably," Purbright said. That afternoon, the second oddity occurred. Mrs. Hearn rang the station, flustered. One of the missing medals had been returned. It lay neatly on the secretary's desk, placed with care, as though apologetically. Purbright arrived within minutes. He examined the medal without touching it. "No note?" he asked. "No," Mrs. Hearn said. "Just there." Purbright smiled faintly. Returning, something was a kind of confession, particularly when done quietly. It suggested unease, or perhaps calculation. As he left the clubhouse, Purbright felt the shape of the matter becoming clearer, not in detail, but in intention. Someone had wanted to unsettle, to correct a balance, to remind the town of something it preferred to forget. He walked back toward the station as the afternoon wore on, already considering the question he would soon ask aloud. It would be a simple one, posed politely, and it would sound almost trivial. Those he knew were the most dangerous kind. The return of the medal had the curious effect of hardening opinion rather than softening it. By early evening, Flaxborough had decided that the thief was growing nervous, which in turn meant he must be young, foolish, and easily frightened. Derek Spence's name circulated with renewed confidence, acquiring detail with every retelling. Someone recalled seeing him run. Someone else was certain he drank too much. A third was prepared to swear that resentment showed plainly in his walk. Inspector Purbright was aware of these developments before Sergeant Lovegrove mentioned them, which he did with the air of a man presenting the inevitable. "We should bring him in," Lovegrove said, "at least have a proper word." Purbright considered this. "A proper word," he repeated. "He's got no alibi worth the name. He knows the place well enough. And now something's come back." "Yes," Purbright said, "something small." Lovegrove frowned. "It's a start." "So is a beginning," Purbright replied. "But they're not always the same thing." Nevertheless, Derek was brought to the station that evening, where he sat stiffly on the edge of a chair that suggested discomfort as policy. Purbright watched him for a moment before speaking, noting the boy's hands, the way his foot tapped, the effort he made to appear indifferent. "You know why you're here?" Purbright said. Derek shrugged. Everyone says I took something. Did you? No. Purbright waited. I didn't, Derek said again, louder this time, as though volume might substitute for conviction. Purbright asked about Wednesday evening once more, about his route home, about the recreation ground after dark. Derek answered as before, with the same gaps, the same blunt honesty. There was no sense of rehearsal, no eagerness to please. "Have you ever handled the medals?" Purbright asked. Derek blinked. What medals? The ones from the cabinet? No. Do you know where they were kept? In the glass thing? Purbright nodded. Do you know which drawer the cash tin was in? Derek hesitated, then shook his head. No, it was the right hesitation. Too long for guessing, too short for invention. Purbright thanked him and had Lovegrove take him home. The sergeant returned, looking dissatisfied. "If it's not him," Lovegrove said, "then we're back where we started." "I don't think we ever were," Purbright replied. The next morning, Councillor Greaves arrived at the station, unannounced, bearing concern and a proposal. The bowling club, he said, wished to cooperate fully. They were prepared to review membership, restrict access, and make an example if necessary. He spoke with the measured cadence of a man accustomed to resolutions. "Public confidence matters," Greaves said. "Indeed," Purbright replied. "And what would reassure it most, do you think?" Greaves did not hesitate. A clear culprit, preferably uncomplicated. "Preferably," Greaves said. Purbright smiled faintly. Uncomplicated things often unravel. Greaves did not smile back. Later that day, Purbright returned to the bowling club once more, this time during a committee meeting convened expressly to address the burglary. The members sat around the long table with their papers arranged defensively. Mrs. Hearn presided with a tight expression. Brixby polished his glasses repeatedly. Mr. Minton sat slightly apart, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Purbright listened as the discussion unfolded. Security, reputation, youths, outsiders. At no point did anyone mention the medal's return as anything other than an act of fear. "Someone must have realized we were closing in," Brixby said. "On whom?" Purbright asked pleasantly. There was a pause. "Well," Greaves said, "we can't rule out Spence." "No," Purbright agreed. "But can we rule out anyone else?" Silence again, heavier this time. Purbright let it settle. He had learned that committees revealed themselves most clearly when they believed nothing further would be said. "May I ask," he continued, "who was responsible for placing the returned medal on the desk?" Mrs. Hearn frowned. "What do you mean? Who discovered it?" "I did." "And did you touch it?" "No, I rang the station at once." "And the desk, was it locked?" "Yes." Purbright nodded. "Who has a key?" She listed names: Greaves, Brixby, herself, Mr. Minton, in his capacity as former secretary. "Former?" Purbright asked. "Yes," she said briskly. "We changed." "Arrangements? Why?" Mrs. Hearn hesitated. It seemed appropriate. Purbright glanced at Mr. Minton, who did not look up. The meeting ended without resolution. As the members dispersed, Purbright lingered by the doorway. Mr. Minton passed him, pausing briefly. "Unpleasant business," Minton said quietly. "Yes," Purbright replied. "It has a way of stirring old feelings." Minton's mouth tightened. "People remember what suits them." "Indeed," Purbright said. "That afternoon, the second disturbance occurred. The silver cup itself was found, not returned, but abandoned, in the shrubbery behind the clubhouse. It was undamaged, but its placement was careless, almost dismissive. The discovery shifted the mood at once. Fear gave way to irritation. This was no longer theft, it was mischief. Worse, it was deliberate. Purbright examined the cup where it lay, noting the angle, the marks in the soil. It had been placed, not dropped, left to be found. A message, then. As he straightened, Purbright felt the investigation settle into a clearer shape. The obvious suspect had served his purpose. drawing attention away from more comfortable quarters. The real matter lay elsewhere, among those who knew how the town worked and how best to unsettle it. He brushed soil from his hands and looked back toward the clubhouse, already considering how he might, very politely, change the direction of the conversation. Some truths, he knew, required encouragement. The discovery of the cup in the shrubbery altered Flaxborough's tone in a subtle but decisive way. It was no longer a matter of loss, it was a matter of intention. Objects returned or abandoned carried meaning, and meaning invited interpretation. By mid-morning, the town had ceased to speculate about thieves and had begun to speculate about motives, a pastime at which it excelled. Inspector Purbright arrived at the bowling club shortly after 9, finding the cup already restored to its place, polished, with an energy that suggested mild indignation. Mrs. Hearn hovered nearby, her movements brisker than usual. "I don't like it," she said, adjusting the cabinet door. "I don't like it at all." "No," Purbright agreed, "it's unsettling." "It feels pointed," she continued, as if someone were making a remark. Purbright smiled faintly. Remarks are often best answered politely. He walked through the clubhouse, pausing by the sink, the desk, the notice board. Nothing was out of place, which in itself suggested effort. He had noticed before that when people tried to erase signs of disturbance, they often revealed the most. Outside, Councillor Greaves was addressing a small knot of members, his voice firm, reassuring. He broke off at Purbright's approach. "We're considering cancelling the open day," Greaves said, "until matters are resolved." "That would be unfortunate," Purbright replied. "It might give the impression that something is being concealed." Greaves stiffened. On the contrary, it would show responsibility. "Responsibility," Purbright repeated. "And who would you say feels most responsible for the club's standing?" Greaves hesitated. "All of us, naturally." Purbright nodded. "Naturally." He spent the remainder of the morning speaking to individuals singly, not about the burglary, but about the club itself. How long they had been members, what it meant to them, which traditions mattered. The answers varied in detail but not in tone. Pride, habit, and quiet rivalry surfaced repeatedly, often in the same breath. When he spoke to Mr. Lionel Brixby again, he asked casually about the evening of the committee meeting. "Busy night," Brixby said. "Papers, discussions, tea." "Did anything go wrong?" Purbright asked. "Wrong? Spilled, perhaps?" Brixby frowned. "I don't remember." Purbright let the matter drop. It was with Mr. Harold Minton that the conversation lingered. Minton received him at home that afternoon, a narrow terrace house with carefully tended roses. Inside, everything was in its place, the air faintly stale with disuse. "I was surprised to hear from you again," Minton said. "I hope not inconvenienced," Purbright replied. "Not at all." Minton gestured to a chair. "Though I've already said all I can, I'm sure," Purbright said. "I was hoping you might say a little more about the cup." Minton's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "What about it?" "You were present when it was awarded." "Yes." "And disappointed not to receive it?" Minton's eyes flickered. "Disappointment is part of life." "Indeed," Purbright said, "but it has a way of settling." Minton said nothing. They spoke of other things then, the club's history, changes in management, the new arrangements Mrs. Hearn had introduced. Minton mentioned, with careful neutrality, that he no longer held a key to the desk. "That was decided collectively," he said. Purbright nodded, "Yet your name was still on the list." Minton's fingers tightened around his teacup. "An oversight." "Possibly," Purbright said. As he left, Purbright noticed a small brass medal on the mantelpiece, half hidden by a photograph. He did not comment. That evening, Sergeant Lovegrove brought news of another development. The cash tin had been found empty, tucked behind the hedge bordering the recreation ground. "No fingerprints," Lovegrove said. "Looks like it's been wiped." Carefully, Purbright asked. Very. Purbright considered this. Care suggested familiarity, not haste. Any sign of the other medals? Lovegrove asked. Not yet, Purbright replied. The town reacted with weary irritation. Enough was enough. This was not theft, it was a nuisance. Someone was playing games, and games invited response. Councillor Greaves proposed a public statement. Mrs. Hearn suggested locks. Brixby suggested discipline. Purbright listened and said nothing. Late that night, he walked the perimeter of the bowling club alone. The grounds were quiet, the green pale in the moonlight. He stopped by the shrubbery where the cup had been found, noting again the deliberate placement, the care taken not to damage it. This was not the work of someone seeking profit. It was the work of someone seeking recognition. Recognition denied, perhaps. He thought of the kettle, moved without reason, of tea spilt and wiped away, of a medal returned to a locked desk, of a cup left where it would be discovered quickly. Each act was restrained, polite, almost apologetic. As he turned back toward the gate, Purbright became aware of movement near the benches. A figure paused, then stepped into the light. "I thought I might find you here," said Miss Ethel Rockham. "Good evening," Purbright said. "I've been thinking," she continued, "about how people behave when they feel slighted." "Yes," Purbright said, "they often tidy." She smiled. "Exactly." They stood in companionable silence for a moment. "You'll sort it out," she said finally. Purbright inclined his head. "Soon." As he walked away, he felt the investigation narrowing, not through force, but through patience. The town had been nudged, gently but persistently, toward remembering something it preferred to forget. And remembering, he knew, was the most dangerous part of all. The following day unfolded with deliberate calm, as though Flaxborough had agreed collectively to stop reacting and simply observe. This change suited Inspector Purbright well. He had found that when people ceased performing outrage, they became more revealing in their ordinary habits. He began the morning at the station, reviewing notes that no longer needed ordering. The pattern had settled. Each act, return, abandonment, concealment, had been executed with restraint. Nothing was damaged, nothing was taken for gain. It was the etiquette of the thing that interested him most. Whoever was responsible had behaved as a member, would behave, not as an intruder. Sergeant Lovegrove hovered nearby, waiting for instruction. "I think," Purbright said at last, "it may be time to widen the circle without appearing to do so." Lovegrove frowned. "Meaning?" "A meeting," Purbright replied. "Not an interview, something sociable." The opportunity presented itself conveniently that afternoon. The bowling club's open roll-up had not been cancelled after all. Pride had prevailed over caution. Members arrived in numbers slightly larger than usual, drawn by a sense that something might happen, simply because nothing had yet been resolved. Purbright attended without uniform, standing at the edge of the green, exchanging pleasantries, watching. He noted who avoided the cabinet and who glanced at it repeatedly, who spoke too much, who spoke not at all. Councillor Greaves circulated with practised geniality, his laughter measured. Lionel Brixby was earnest, slightly flushed, eager to be helpful. Mrs. Hearn remained close to the clubhouse, vigilant. Mr. Minton arrived late and took a position near the benches, his hands folded behind his back. Purbright joined him. "Good afternoon," he said. Minton nodded. "Inspector, enjoying the sunshine?" "Yes," Minton said, though he did not look at the sky. They watched a bowl roll to rest just short of the jack. "Near enough," Minton murmured. "Sometimes," Purbright said, "near enough is precisely the trouble." Minton shifted slightly. As the afternoon progressed, Purbright moved quietly among the members, asking questions that were not about the burglary. He asked about past tournaments, about changes in rules, about who had proposed what and when. Names recurred, decisions resurfaced. The awarding of the cup was mentioned more than once, usually with a polite smoothing of tone that suggested unfinished business. At one point, Purbright asked casually who had suggested moving the medals to the lower shelf in the cabinet some years ago. "That was Mr. Minton," Brixby said. "Said they were less likely to be knocked." Purbright nodded. "Practical." "Yes," Brixby agreed, "always was." Late in the afternoon, as the roll-up dispersed, Purbright suggested tea. The clubhouse filled again, this time with a different energy. Cups were poured, chairs scraped, conversation resumed its smaller rhythms. Purbright waited until everyone was settled. "I wonder," he said pleasantly, "if I might ask something of you all." There was a pause. "It concerns the events of last week," he continued. "Not the missing items themselves, but the manner in which they were handled." Councillor Greaves straightened. "We've been more than cooperative, I'm sure," Purbright said. "This is simply for clarity." He described, without accusation, the sequence of events: the medal returned to a locked desk, the cup placed where it would be found, the cash tin hidden carefully. He did not use the word theft. These actions, he said, suggest someone who wished to make a point without causing harm, someone familiar with the club's routines. Eyes shifted. A cup rattled faintly in a saucer. "Such a person," Purbright went on, "would also know who held keys, who arrived late, who left early." He paused, then added lightly, "and who might be assumed innocent." The silence deepened. Purbright turned his attention to Mrs. Hearn. "You mentioned the kettle being moved." "Yes." "Who last used it?" "I don't know." Purbright looked at Mr. Minton. "You were secretary for many years." "Yes." "You made tea frequently." Minton's expression did not change. "That was my duty." "And you were accustomed," Purbright said gently, "to leaving things exactly as you preferred them." Minton looked up then. "Are you accusing me?" "No," Purbright said, "I'm asking you." The distinction hung between them. Minton glanced around the room. Faces watched him now, not hostile, but curious, expectant. "I was overlooked," he said quietly. "That is all." "Overlooked?" Greaves said sharply. "For the cup," Minton replied, "for the recognition, for years of service." "That was a committee decision," Greaves said. "Yes," Minton said, "it often is." Purbright allowed the moment to settle. "You did?" "I not intend to steal," he said. "You intended to remind." Minton's shoulders sagged slightly. "I wanted it noticed." "And now it has been," Purbright said. "Sufficiently." There was no drama, no raised voices, only a slow realignment of understanding. Purbright thanked them all for their time and suggested the matter would soon be concluded formally. As the group dispersed, the atmosphere shifted. Not relieved, but recalibrated. Outside, dusk gathered once more. Purbright walked away from the clubhouse with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew the final step remained, but that its direction was now clear. The truth, having been invited politely into the room, had decided to stay. And that, he reflected, was usually the beginning of the end. The admission, such as it was, did not settle the town. It merely rearranged its anxieties. By the following morning, Flaxborough had divided itself neatly into those who believed the matter essentially resolved and those who believed it very much not. Inspector Purbright, who belonged to neither camp, returned to his office to find Sergeant Lovegrove reading the local paper with exaggerated care. "They're saying you've got a confession," Lovegrove said. "They're saying a great many things," Purbright replied. "Most of them will change by lunchtime." Lovegrove folded the paper. "Minton admitted enough, didn't he?" "He admitted feeling overlooked," Purbright said. "Which is not a crime." Lovegrove frowned. "But he took the things." Purbright shook his head. "He moved them. He returned some. He abandoned others. But he did not take the last medal." Lovegrove looked up. "Last?" "Yes. Purbright said. "One is still missing." The detail had escaped notice amid the general relief. Of the small collection of medals, one remained unaccounted for. The most recent, modest in size, awarded the previous year. It had not been returned. It had not been found. It had simply vanished. "And Minton?" Lovegrove asked. "Had no interest in that one," Purbright said. It represented something else. The second incident, when it came, was not dramatic. Mrs. Hearn discovered the missing medal's ribbon tucked carefully into the secretary's drawer, folded as neatly as a handkerchief. There was no medal attached. Purbright examined it with quiet attention. "Someone wanted the symbol," he said, "but not the display." Lovegrove exhaled. "So we're not done?" "No," Purbright agreed. "We're merely more specific." The town reacted badly to this refinement. Councillor Greaves insisted on finality. Lionel Brixby grew defensive. Mrs. Hearn became flustered. The notion that there might be more than one motive, more than one hand, unsettled Flaxborough more deeply than the burglary itself. Purbright returned to the bowling club alone that afternoon. The clubhouse was empty, the green unused. He sat at the long table and allowed the silence to speak. Two narratives overlap now, one of grievance made visible, and another of opportunity quietly seized. He considered the recent medal. It had been awarded to a newer member, someone whose enthusiasm had been noted, whose presence had altered long-standing hierarchies. Recognition, once granted, had a way of redistributing resentment. Purbright stood and walked slowly around the room, pausing at the cabinet. The empty space where the medal had been was almost apologetic. He imagined the hand that had opened the door this time, not to make a point, but to keep something. That evening, he spoke again with Miss Ethel Rockham, who listened with her head slightly tilted, her knitting resting idle in her lap. "People don't like change," she said, "not even small, tidy change." "Especially not when it's tidy," Purbright replied. "It makes comparisons easier." She nodded. "The new member, Mr. Collins, youngish, keen?" "Yes," Purbright said, "and observant. He notices who sits where," Miss Rocombe said. "Who pours the tea, and who receives the medals," Purbright added. "The following morning." Purbright invited Mr. Andrew Collins to the station, framing the request as a formality. Collins arrived promptly, neatly dressed, eager to assist. He spoke warmly of the club, of tradition, of his pleasure at being included. "You were pleased with the medal," Purbright said. "Of course," Collins replied. "It meant a great deal." "And disappointed," Purbright continued, "that it was taken." "Yes." "More disappointed than angry." Collins hesitated. "I suppose so." Purbright leaned back. "You returned the ribbon." Collins flushed. "I didn't take the medal." "No," Purbright said. "You kept it." The silence that followed was brief but telling. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Collins said finally. "I just didn't want it back there." After everything that was said. "What was said?" Purbright asked. "That it was only encouragement, that it didn't mean what the others meant." Purbright nodded. "So you decided it would mean something else?" Collins looked down. "I thought if it vanished, people might reconsider, or at least notice," Purbright said. Collins said nothing. The matter was resolved quietly. The medal was returned. Apologies were exchanged without enthusiasm. No charges were pressed. The town preferred its conclusions civil and its disturbances manageable. Purbright attended the final meeting at the bowling club, where he explained the sequence of events with careful neutrality. He spoke of human motives, of recognition and resentment, of how small symbols could carry disproportionate weight. There was no villain, he said, only people attempting clumsily to correct what they perceived as imbalance. The town accepted this with mixed relief. In the days that followed, routines resumed. The cabinet was refilled, locks were checked, tea was poured with renewed attention. Yet something had shifted. The club was quieter, its certainties slightly less assured. Inspector Purbright returned to his paperwork, the case reduced to notes and reflections. He knew that Flaxborough would remember the burglary not as a crime, but as a moment when its manners had failed it briefly. Such moments, he reflected, were often the most instructive. And though the green remained immaculate, the game itself would never be played quite the same way again. In the lull that followed resolution, Flaxborough behaved as towns often did when relieved of excitement. It grew reflective without admitting it. Inspector Purbright sensed this change not through conversation, which remained stubbornly practical, but through pauses. Those brief hesitations before people spoke, as though recalculating what might safely be said now that the worst had been avoided. He did not hurry to close his file. Instead, he walked the town over the next 2 days with no particular destination, allowing himself to be noticed and ignored in equal measure. At the post office, Mrs. Tallis spoke of the weather and nothing else. At the butcher's, a man stopped mid-sentence and then continued with care. Outside the bowling club, members nodded politely but did not linger. It was in such small adjustments that Purbright saw the true aftermath taking shape. On the third morning, he returned to the clubhouse alone. The cabinet was full again. The cups shone, the medals lay properly spaced, and the glass door had been cleaned so thoroughly that it caught the light with a faint glare. Mrs. Hearn had done her work conscientiously, restoring not only order, but reassurance. Purbright stood before the cabinet for some time, hands clasped behind his back. He was thinking not of guilt, but of proportion. No crime had been committed in the usual sense. Nothing had been sold, destroyed, or spirited away. Yet the town had been unsettled more deeply than if a stranger had smashed a window and fled with the lot. This disturbance had come from within, and that made all the difference. He moved to the benches outside and sat, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the nearer scrape of a broom. Lionel Brixby was tidying the green, though it scarcely needed it. He worked with unnecessary vigour, his movements brisk, corrective. "You're still thinking about it," Brixby said, not looking up. "Yes," Purbright replied. "Are you?" Brixby paused. "I suppose I am." Purbright waited. "It wasn't right," Brixby said at last. "All that business makes you wonder who you're sitting next to, or what they might be wondering about you," Purbright said gently. Brixby grimaced. "That too." They spoke a little longer, not about the burglary, but about the club's future. Membership numbers, declining interest among the young, the difficulty of maintaining traditions without turning them into obstacles. Brixby spoke with a hint of unease, as though the events had shaken more than his confidence in security. Later that day, Purbright visited Mr. Minton once more, this time at the latter's request. Minton received him with a certain formality, offering tea he did not drink himself. "I wanted to say," Minton began, "that I regret how things were handled." "Yes," Purbright said, "regret often arrives late." "I did not anticipate," Minton continued, "that it would become complicated." Purbright smiled faintly. "Most feelings are." Minton looked at him steadily. "You understood it, though?" Purbright considered this. "I understood the shape of it. The feeling itself belongs to you." Minton nodded. That may be worse. Perhaps it was, Purbright thought. Feelings rarely stood trial. They lingered instead, quietly rearranging behaviour. That evening he made his final notes on the case. He did not describe it as a burglary. He described it as a disturbance arising from perceived imbalance, aggravated by habit and mitigated by discretion. It was not language that would excite interest beyond Flaxborough, but that seemed appropriate. The town preferred its difficulties named softly. As he closed the file, Purbright reflected on the curious economy of recognition. A cup awarded once could echo for years. A medal given lightly could weigh heavily. People measured themselves constantly, though they pretended otherwise, and the smallest adjustments could feel like judgments. The following afternoon, the bowling club held a modest gathering. Nothing formal, tea, biscuits, polite conversation. Purbright attended briefly, more observer than participant. He noticed that Andrew Collins was treated with a careful cordiality, neither celebrated nor excluded. Mr. Minton spoke little but listened intently. Councillor Greaves presided with a slightly diminished certainty, as though aware that authority, once questioned, never fully recovered its former ease. As Purbright prepared to leave, Miss Ethel Rowcombe approached him, her knitting once again in motion. "It's quieter," she said. "Yes," Purbright agreed. "Do you think it will last?" He considered this. For a time, she smiled. "That's all one can ask." Walking back toward the station, Purbright felt the case settling into its proper place. Not as a solved puzzle, but as a lesson absorbed imperfectly. Flaxborough would return to its routines, but with a faint awareness that manners could fracture, and that symbols, once disturbed, did not always resume their former meanings. That awareness would fade, of course. Such things usually did. But it would leave a trace, a slight adjustment in tone, a pause before certainty. Inspector Purbright found that this suited him very well. The most important work, he reflected, was rarely the work that announced itself. The sense of quiet that settled over Flaxborough after the gathering did not bring closure so much as a different kind of tension. One, less visible but more persistent. Inspector Purbright felt it in the rhythm of the town, in the slightly delayed greetings, in the way conversations began on one subject and drifted away from it without explanation, in the careful neutrality that replaced former certainty. He returned to the station with the file still open on his desk, its contents already neat, already resolved in every formal sense. Yet something in him resisted closing it. Experience had taught him that resolution and understanding were not always the same thing. Sergeant Lovegrove noticed. "You're not finished," he said. Purbright smiled faintly. "I'm finished with the facts." Lovegrove frowned. "But not the people, not quite." That afternoon, Purbright made a deliberate decision to intervene once more, not as an investigator, but as a presence. He arranged, through Mrs. Hearn, a small informal meeting at the bowling club, ostensibly to clarify a few remaining procedural details. Access, keys, future arrangements, nothing official, nothing accusatory, a conversation, not an inquiry. The gathering was modest. Councillor Greaves attended, as did Lionel Brixby, Mrs. Hearn, Mr. Minton, Andrew Collins, and two other long-standing members whose main qualification was longevity. Tea was served. Biscuits were offered and declined with ritual politeness. Purbright began without preamble. "I don't wish to revisit events," he said calmly. "They are understood. What interests me now is what follows." Silence greeted this, attentive rather than defensive. "When something like this happens," he continued, "a town has a choice. It can close ranks or it can adjust." Councillor Greaves straightened. "We've adjusted." "Yes," Purbright said, "administratively, but I mean socially." No one spoke. Purbright turned slightly toward Andrew Collins. "You felt your recognition was diminished." Collins nodded, uncomfortable. "I felt it was minimized." Purbright inclined his head, then turned toward Mr. Minton. "You felt yours had been denied." Minton said nothing, but his expression confirmed it. "And you," Purbright said gently to Greaves, "felt that order had to be preserved." Greaves hesitated. "That's my responsibility." "Yes," Purbright agreed, "and it's a heavy one." He let the moment breathe. These are not criminal instincts, Purbright said. They are human ones. But when they overlap, they produce disturbance. Mrs. Hearn shifted in her chair. Are you saying we're all to blame? No, Purbright replied. I'm saying no one is entirely innocent of the atmosphere in which things happen. The phrase lingered. What would you have us do? Brixby asked. Purbright smiled faintly. Very little. Just slightly differently. He spoke then of small changes, rotating responsibilities, transparent decisions, shared recognition. Nothing dramatic, nothing that resembled reform. Simply adjustments that prevented power and prestige from settling too comfortably in the same places for too long. The conversation remained polite, but its undercurrent was unmistakable. This was not instruction, it was exposure. He was not imposing change, he was making stasis visible. When the meeting ended, no resolutions were passed, no declarations made. But something had shifted again, subtly, quietly, like furniture rearranged in the dark. As they left, Councillor Greaves lingered. You're very careful, Inspector, he said. I try to be, Purbright replied. Greaves studied him. You could have made this public. Yes, Purbright said, and nothing would have changed. Greaves nodded once. Perhaps not. That evening, Purbright walked alone along the recreation ground. The bowling club lay behind him, lit softly, its windows reflecting nothing but themselves. The green was empty, the jack resting untouched at one end. He thought of how easily a symbol could become a fault line, how quietly communities measured worth, how seldom anyone spoke plainly about status, and how often they acted on it instead. The case, in any formal sense, was complete. No charges, no scandal, no disruption beyond the town's own conscience. Yet this final act, this polite confrontation, felt to Purbright like the true conclusion. Not the identification of wrongdoing, but the exposure of pattern. At the station. Later he closed the file at last, not with satisfaction but with acceptance. Some cases, he knew, were not meant to be solved so much as understood. Their purpose was not justice, but correction, small, social, imprecise, and therefore lasting. Flaxborough would forget the burglary soon enough. It would remember the unease longer, and it would adapt, quietly, as towns always did, by absorbing disturbance into habit until it felt like continuity again. Inspector Purbright turned out the light in his office and paused for a moment, listening to the familiar silence. It was not peace, but it was balance. And for now, he knew, that would have to be enough. By the end of the week, Flaxborough had settled into what it liked to believe was normality. The bowling club reopened fully, its open hours restored, its notice board refreshed with fresh paper and firm handwriting. Tea was made without comment. Bowls were rolled with customary seriousness. To an outsider, nothing appeared altered. Inspector Purbright knew better. He returned to the clubhouse on Friday afternoon, at Mrs. Hearn's invitation, nominally, to confirm that all recovered items had been logged correctly. In truth, the invitation served a different purpose. The town, having absorbed the disturbance, now wished to hear it explained, properly, conclusively, and preferably without embarrassment. They gathered in the familiar committee room, Councillor Greaves at the head of the table, Mrs. Hearn beside him, Lionel Brixby attentive, Mr. Minton reserved, Andrew Collins composed but uneasy, and two others whose presence represented continuity rather than influence. Tea was poured, biscuits were passed, the rituals were reassuring. Purbright took his seat last. "I won't take up much of your time," he said pleasantly. "I thought it might be useful to set out what happened, in order, and then leave the matter where it belongs." Councillor Greaves nodded, his expression neutral but intent. Purbright began with the first disappearance. He spoke of access rather than opportunity, of knowledge rather than impulse. He described how the items had been selected, not the most valuable, but the most meaningful, cups and medals that represented recognition, memory, precedence. They were taken, he said, by someone who did not feel like a thief. Mr. Minton's gaze dropped to the table. Purbright continued calmly explaining the returns. The medal placed carefully on the desk, the cup abandoned where it would be found quickly, and undamaged, the cash tin wiped and hidden rather than emptied recklessly. These actions, he said, were deliberate, restrained, and above all, familiar. They were the actions of members correcting what they believed to be an error. He spoke next of the missing ribbon and of what it represented. Not loss, but retention. A desire to keep something back, to hold on to a symbol that had not yet settled into the shared narrative of the club. Andrew Collins shifted in his chair. There were, Purbright said, two separate impulses at work, one rooted in long-standing grievance, the other in newly acquired disappointment. They did not coordinate, but they overlapped. Councillor Greaves frowned. So it was confusion. No, Purbright replied, it was clarity pursued without conversation. He turned, gently, toward Mr. Minton. You felt your service had been overlooked, he said. The cup mattered because it said something publicly that you felt had been said privately for years. Minton nodded once. I wanted it acknowledged. And you, Purbright said, addressing Collins, felt your recognition was diminished as soon as it was granted. Collins exhaled. I was told it was encouragement, not achievement. Purbright inclined his head. So you removed the symbol from circulation, hoping to force a reconsideration. Silence followed, not accusatory, but reflective. Neither of these actions, Purbright continued, was malicious. Neither was criminal in intent, but both disrupted the club because they substituted action for discussion. He paused, allowing the point to settle. The reason the town found this so unsettling, he said, was not the disappearance of objects, but the revelation that its systems of recognition were fragile, that people were counting, comparing, and concluding without saying so aloud. Mrs. Hearn folded her hands. We didn't realize? No, Purbright said gently. You assumed agreement where there was only habit. Councillor Greaves cleared his throat. And now? Now, Purbright said, you decide whether the matter ends as a solved inconvenience or as a lesson. He closed his notebook, not sharply, but with finality. There will be no charges, he said. No reports beyond the administrative. The items are returned. Apologies have been made. He stood. But I would suggest, he added, that future awards be discussed with the same care you give to their presentation. No one argued. The meeting ended without formality. Chairs were pushed back, cups were collected. People spoke quietly as though emerging from a shared thought rather than a decision. As Purbright left the clubhouse, Councillor Greaves followed him to the door. You've been very considerate, Greaves said. Purbright smiled faintly. Consideration is often more effective than authority. Greaves nodded, though whether in agreement or resignation was unclear. Outside, the afternoon light lay evenly across the green. A single bowl rested near the jack, abandoned mid-practice. Purbright paused, then nudged it gently with his foot, sending it a fraction closer. Near enough, he thought. He walked back toward the station with the unhurried step of a man whose work was almost finished. The town resumed its quiet rhythms behind him, altered only by a faint awareness that its assumptions had been examined and found wanting. There remained one final thing to do. Nothing procedural, nothing dramatic. Simply the act of stepping away and allowing Flaxborough to live with what it now knew. Inspector Purbright found that this, too, required patience, and patience, he reflected, was a discipline the town might yet learn to share. The following Monday arrived with an air of orderly indifference, as if Flaxborough had filed the bowling club affair under unfortunate but resolved and intended not to reopen it unless absolutely necessary. The town's routines resumed with the quiet determination of people who preferred their disturbances brief and their explanations shorter still. Shopkeepers swept thresholds. The postman complained about the weight of catalogues. Councillor Greaves attended to municipal matters with renewed briskness, as though speed might restore authority. Inspector Purbright returned to his office at the station and found that nothing awaited him beyond the usual small burdens, forms, correspondence, and a minor complaint involving a neighbour's hens. It was tempting in such circumstances to believe that cases ended when paperwork did. Purbright had never found that to be true. He walked later that morning past the recreation ground and toward the bowling club, not because he expected further trouble, but because he understood that aftermath had its own evidence. People behaved differently once they believed themselves safe again. The smallest shifts could reveal what had truly been learned. At the clubhouse, Mrs. Hearn was unlocking the door with ceremonial care. She looked up and gave him a smile that tried hard to be ordinary. "Inspector," she said, "everything's quite in order now." "I'm pleased," Purbright replied. "You look relieved." "I am," she said. Then, after a pause that betrayed her, she added, "Though I've moved the keys." "To where?" She hesitated. "Somewhere sensible." Purbright smiled faintly. Sensible places often become secret ones. Inside, the cabinet gleamed. Cups and medals sat in their velvet beds as if they had never moved, as if the shrubbery had never cradled. A silver cup in humiliation, as if a ribbon had never returned without its weight. The glass was immaculate. The lock looked new. Mrs. Hearn hovered beside it, her hands clasped. "People have been kinder," she said. "Have they?" Purbright asked. "Well," she replied, choosing her words, "not to everyone." "But there's been more thoughtfulness," Purbright nodded. Thoughtfulness was what towns called discomfort once it had been made respectable. On the green, Lionel Brixby was arranging bowls with a seriousness that bordered on penitence. He greeted Purbright with a nod, and then, after a moment, spoke in a lower voice. "We've decided," Brixby said, "to rotate the committee duties." Purbright raised his eyebrows. "A radical gesture," Brixby grimaced. "Mrs. Hearn says it's common sense." "And Councillor Greaves?" Purbright asked mildly. Brixby hesitated, then offered a careful smile. "He says it's a practical experiment." Purbright said nothing. Practical experiments, he knew, were often how pride agreed to change without admitting it had been wrong. Andrew Collins arrived shortly after, carrying a bag of bowls and a faintly guarded expression. He greeted Purbright politely, then looked away toward the green as if hoping to escape notice through routine. Two older members nodded to him with a neutrality that was almost generous. Collins returned the nods, neither eager nor resentful. It was, Purbright observed, the best one could hope for in a town that valued composure above reconciliation. Mr. Minton did not appear. Purbright mentioned this to Miss Ethel Rockham, who sat on a bench with her knitting, as reliably placed as the jack. "He won't come for a little while," she said. "Because of shame?" Purbright asked. "Because of pride," Miss Rockham replied. "Shame would be simpler." Purbright smiled. "You're very clear about people." "I've had practice," she said, her needles clicking softly. "And I've seen what happens when a town pretends not to notice what it's noticed." Purbright watched a bowl roll and settle neatly near the jack. The game continued, quiet, measured, its rules unchanged. Yet its atmosphere had altered. People spoke a little less, and when they did, they listened more carefully. Later that afternoon, Purbright returned to the station and found a letter on his desk, handwritten, the envelope addressed in a precise hand. He opened it without hurry. It was from Mr. Minton. The letter contained no confession. There had been enough of that already, but an apology of sorts, framed as regret for unseemly conduct and misjudged expression. It ended with a single sentence that struck Purbright as the truest thing Minton had said. "I thought I wanted the cup, but I believe I wanted the room to remember I had been in it." Purbright folded the letter and placed it in the file, not as evidence, but as context. That evening, as he completed the final administrative notes, Sergeant Lovegrove leaned in the doorway. "Quiet now, Lovegrove," said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "Do you think it'll stay that way?" Purbright considered the question, then shook his head slightly. "Not permanently. Towns are like clubs. They settle, then they shift, then they settle again." Lovegrove grunted. "So what was it all for?" Purbright looked down at the file, then closed it with a gentle firmness. "For Flaxborough," he said, "it was a reminder that respectability is not the same as fairness, and that symbols, cups, medals, keys, only remain harmless so long as everyone agrees what they mean." He stood, turned out the lamp, and listened for a moment to the familiar stillness of the station. Outside, the town went on, composed and unhurried, its surfaces restored. But beneath those surfaces lay a faint adjustment, a new caution in speech, a new awareness in habit, a small reluctance to assume too quickly. Inspector Purbright found that sufficient. One did not ask for transformation in Flaxborough. One asked at best for a slight change in tone. He put on his coat, stepped into the evening, and walked home at his usual pace, leaving the bowling club and its polished cabinet behind him to shine quietly in the dark.